Okay, let's unpack this. Because I read this statistic in the materials, and I just couldn't get it out of my head.
Yeah, it's a rough one.
So picture a fruit vendor in Chennai, India, right? She wakes up at like 3 in the morning, takes this crowded rickshaw to the wholesale market, and she borrows $5 just to buy her vegetables for the day.
Just $5.
Right. And she spends the next 12 hours standing in the brutal heat just selling her stock.
Hmm.
And then she repays that loan at night. But she pays a 4.69% daily interest rate on that money.
Yeah, a figure that often kind of slips past casual observers because, 4.69%, that sounds like a standard annual mortgage rate or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
But compounded daily, I mean, the math becomes predatory on a scale that is just, it's hard to even visualize.
Right, because if she just rolled that specific $5 debt over
Yeah.
for a single year, compounding daily at 4.69%, it would turn into nearly $100 million.
Yep.
$100 million from $5.
It's just staggering.
It really is.
Yeah.
So we are pulling from an incredible stack of sources today. Poor economics thinking in systems and the behavioral science research and scarcity to really figure out how a hardworking person gets trapped in math like that.
Because that's the real question, right?
Yeah, our mission
Yep.
for this deep dive
Yeah.
is to look at poverty not as a lack of character or even just a lack of money, but as this complex system of reinforcing feedback loops.
Right, because to understand that Chennai fruit vendor, we first have to sort of map out the invisible mechanics, keeping her exactly where she is.
Right.
I mean, traditional economics trains us to look for a linear cause and effect. The assumption is, a lack of money causes poverty.
Yeah.
Therefore, if you just inject money into the situation, the poverty should logically disappear.
But the reality of global poverty is murky, right? It's totally counterintuitive. It doesn't operate in straight lines at all.
No, it doesn't. Systems operate on feedback loops. Like when you read Thinking in Systems, you realize a system's behavior is often just caused by its own internal structure. You have balancing loops, which try to keep things stable, and then reinforcing loops, which compound and snowball.
The snowball effect.
Exactly. And the authors of Poor Economics, they visualize this specific systemic trap using what they call the S-curve.
Okay, so let's try to paint a picture of this. Imagine a graph, right? The horizontal axis represents your wealth today, and the vertical axis represents your wealth tomorrow.
Okay, yeah.
If the world were perfectly linear, you just have a straight diagonal line pointing up and to the right. Like what you have today equals what you have tomorrow, plus maybe a little steady, predictable growth.
Right, a nice straight line. But for the world's poorest, that curve is actually shaped like a lazy S.
A lazy S.
Yeah. So below a certain hump on that S-curve, small investments yield tiny, like almost negative returns.
Wait, negative returns.
Yeah. So if you are existing in a state of extreme poverty and you somehow manage to make a tiny bit of extra money today, tomorrow, you will likely actually have less.
Because basic survival just consumes it all, right?
Exactly.
Like your basal metabolic needs the sheer physical calories required to just do manual labor or a sudden medical emergency or even just a minor shock like a leaky roof. It just eats the extra income.
Yep, it's gone. You are stuck in a negative reinforcing loop.
Wow.
The poor get poorer mathematically. You are trapped in the belly of that S-curve. But if you can somehow marshal enough resources to get above that hump...
Then you hit the virtuous reinforcing loop.
Right, exactly.
Your investments actually start to compound.
Yeah.
You generate enough surplus to save, to invest in better equipment to grow.
You're rich, get richer.
Yeah, I kind of like to think of this S-curve like escaping Earth's gravity.
Oh, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Right, because if you only have a little bit of rocket fuel, you might launch 100 feet into the air, which feels like incredible progress.
Right, you're off the ground.
Yeah, but you don't have enough velocity to break orbit. You need a massive concentrated burst of fuel to actually break free of gravity and stay in space. Otherwise, you're just coming back down.
And crashing back down isn't just a metaphor here. It translates to a stolen pushcart, or a ruined crop, or a sick child. The gravity is relentless.
So this is where I want to push back a little bit, or at least ask the question that traditional economists ask.
Shut up, yeah.
If traditional economics assumes that people are at their core rational actors, why wouldn't our Chennai fruit vendor just act rationally?
Right, the rational choice.
Yeah, why wouldn't she just save like 2 pennies a day, skip a cup of tea, and slowly accumulate enough quote-unquote fuel over a few months to buy her own vegetables in cash, just escaping that 4.69% daily interest forever?
Well, policymakers have asked that exact question for decades. They look at the math and they often conclude that, well, the poor must be myopic or they lack financial education.
Right.
Or simply, they just aren't motivated enough to save.
But the research in scarcity completely dismantles that assumption, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the vendor waking up at 3 a.m. to hustle in the wholesale market and standing in the sun all day, she's demonstrating immense motivation and forward planning.
Absolutely. So what is actually happening in her brain when she decides to take that daily loan? It all comes down to the psychological condition of scarcity.
Okay.
Scarcity isn't just the physical state of having an empty wallet or an empty pantry. It literally captures the mind.
Captures the mind.
Yeah, it creates this, what they call a bandwidth tax.
A bandwidth tax.
Right. When a person is constantly juggling the terrifying math of daily survival, like calculating how to feed their kids tonight while figuring out how to pay the wholesaler tomorrow morning, they lose cognitive capacity.
They tunnel. Their brain just narrows its field of vision.
Just like looking through a physical tunnel, you focus exclusively on the light at the end, which is the immediate emergency, the fire burning right in front of you,
Wow.
because your bandwidth is entirely consumed by managing the present crisis. You lose the cognitive slack needed to plan for the long term.
So you physically do not have the mental space to calculate the compounding nature of a 4.69% daily interest rate or to strategize some multi-month savings plan.
Exactly. Every ounce of mental energy is spent just trying to survive until Tuesday.
Right.
It's a severely overtaxed operating system.
Yeah.
And when you have no slack in your cognitive bandwidth, you also tend to have no buffer in your financial life.
And that lack of a buffer is precisely what turns a temporary setback into a permanent trap.
Yeah.
Like the story. Poor Economics details about Ibu Tina in Indonesia.
Oh, right. Ibu Tina. That's a perfect example.
Yeah, she and her husband ran this profitable garment business. They'd actually scaled up to 4 employees. They owned several sewing machines, and they were generating a solid, reliable profit margin.
They had successfully navigated above the hump on the S-curve.
Right. They had broken orbit, and they were cruising.
They were. But then they experienced this seemingly minor shock. A theft occurred, and it cost them a chunk of their working capital. And then shortly after that, her husband developed severe vision problems, and he couldn't work. So because they had reinvested everything into the business and they didn't have a deep liquid financial buffer, she had to borrow money from a local moneylender at 10% monthly interest.
Monthly.
Monthly, yeah, just to buy his medicine and keep food on the table.
And 10% monthly compounds devastatingly fast.
It does. She fell behind on the interest payments almost immediately. The debt just ballooned.
Of course.
So to pay the moneylender, they had to start selling off their sewing machines and letting their employees go.
They're literally dismantling the engine that got them into orbit.
Exactly. The business shrank back down below the scale needed to actually be profitable. So a temporary health and theft shock combined with a lack of slack pulled her backward down the S-curve right back into the poverty trap.
That is just heartbreaking. Because if a sudden health shock completely wipes out Ibu Tina's business because she has no financial buffer, where does she turn? I mean, formal banks require the very slack that she just lost, right? They want collateral, formal credit histories, regular income deposits.
Right. And the formal banking system generally just refuses to touch the extreme poor, which leaves this massive vacuum.
Yeah.
This highlights the incredibly high cost of being poor. The reluctance of formal banks isn't just about prejudice either. It's driven by the mechanics of administrative costs.
Right. It's the multiplier effect on tiny loans. If a traditional bank is going to lend someone $5, the institutional cost to process the formal paperwork, run a background check, and send someone to collect the money is astronomically higher than the few cents of interest they could ever legally make on that $5 principal.
It is entirely unviable for a formal institution with high overhead to engage in that kind of microtransaction,
Right.
which forces the poor to rely on informal systems for contract enforcement and liquidity so the moneylenders step into the void.
And the historical examples and the sources are so vivid here.
They really are.
Like in Calcutta during the 1960s and 70s, many moneylenders were Kabuliwalas, which were men originally from Kabul, Afghanistan.
All right.
And they wore traditional voluminous Afghan clothing. They were generally much taller than the local population, and they just presented this deeply intimidating physical presence.
Yeah, intimidation as collateral, basically. And in other regions of India, lenders would employ eunuchs for debt collection, leveraging complex, deep-seated social stigmas to embarrass families into paying their debts.
Wow. So these informal lenders completely bypass the need for background checks or credit scores.
Hmm.
They use a totally different system of enforcement.
Exactly.
They rely on intimidation, deep local social knowledge, and the threat of public shame. Like, they know exactly where you live, they know your extended family, and they have the social leverage to make your life miserable if you default.
Which is terrifying. But this localized knowledge eliminates the administrative costs that paralyze formal banks, but it also grants the moneylenders a localized monopoly,
Right.
allowing them to charge exorbitant predatory rates.
But here's the paradox that blew my mind. Even when formal banks are available, people sometimes still choose the 70% moneylender.
Oh yeah, the jewel loans.
Yes. The research details these jewel loans in rural Tamil Nadu. People were taking their gold jewelry to a local moneylender, who charged over 70% annual interest, completely ignoring the formal bank in their own village that offered the exact same jewel loan at 13% interest.
It seems crazy, right?
I mean, why would a rational person choose to pay 70% when 13% is sitting right down the street?
It brings us directly back to the bandwidth tax of scarcity.
Okay.
The formal bank offering 13% operated on rigid bureaucratic hours.
Right.
Securing the loan required filling out formal paperwork, making multiple visits during the workday, standing in long lines, and waiting days for official approval.
Right. And for someone who is tunneling on an immediate screaming crisis, say you need to buy fertilizer before the rain stops, that bureaucratic hassle is a cognitive and temporal cost they literally cannot afford to pay.
Exactly. The 70% moneylender is fast, flexible, asks no questions, and hands you the cash in 3 minutes. The system of the formal bank was designed by people with plenty of slack, without an ounce of empathy for the lived, high-stress reality of the client's scarcity.
That is such a profound point, which is why the Microfinance Institution, or MFI, was such a revolutionary systemic intervention.
Oh, totally. Pioneers like Muhammad Yunus with the Grameen Bank, or organizations like Spandana in India and BRA in Bangladesh, they engineered a brilliant structural solution to the administrative cost problem.
Right.
They figured out how to lend to the poor without the threat of violence used by the Kabuliwalas, but with enough flexibility to actually function in a low-bandwidth environment.
And their secret weapon was group lending, right?
Group lending, yeah. They lend to a small group of women simultaneously. And the systemic rule is really simple. If one woman in the group defaults on her portion, the entire group is permanently cut off from future loans.
Wow, so that structure completely outsources the bank's screening and monitoring costs to the community itself.
Exactly. The women in the village already know who is reliable, whose husband drinks away the profits, and who runs a tight business.
So they naturally filter out the high-risk borrowers before the group is even formed.
And they will exert intense social pressure on each other to ensure weekly repayment. It dramatically lowers the MFI's operational costs, allowing them to charge around 25% annual interest.
Right, which still sounds high to a Westerner used to prime rates, but it is a massive, life-altering relief compared to a moneylender's 70% or 1,000% annualized rates.
Definitely.
But this brings up a really provocative question.
Okay.
If microfinance solves the administrative cost problem, and we've been deploying it globally for decades, why hasn't it cured global poverty? I mean, why are there still millions of poor fruit vendors? The math suggests this intervention should have scaled them all out of poverty by now.
Yeah, and it's one of the most sobering insights from poor economics. We have to look at the shape of the growth curve for informal businesses. We discussed the S-curve earlier, right, where you need a big push to break orbit.
Right.
But for many micro-entrepreneurs utilizing MFIs, the reality is actually an L-shaped curve, specifically an inverted L.
Wait, an inverted L curve. So it shoots up quickly at the start, but then it hits a hard horizontal ceiling and just flattens out entirely.
Exactly. Let's trace the trajectory of a trash sorter in Guntur, India. She secures her first small microloan and uses it to pay off a crippling high-interest debt to a local moneylender.
Okay, that is a huge immediate win.
Right. With her second loan, she buys a pushcart so she can cover twice the territory and collect more recyclable trash. Another significant win.
Right, the marginal returns of those first two microloans are sky high. She is climbing the vertical part of the inverted L.
But to grow further, to actually escape poverty and build generational wealth, a pushcart just isn't enough.
Right. She would need to buy a commercial truck.
Yeah, exactly. She'd need to lease a warehouse to store bulk recyclables. She'd need to hire and manage a staff of sorters and navigate formal accounting and tax systems.
And the leap from a solitary pushcart to a commercial warehouse operation isn't a microloan. That is a macro loan.
Yeah, and neither the MFIs, whose risk models are built entirely on small, uncollateralized group loans, nor the formal commercial banks will lend her the massive capital required to cross that chasm.
Wow.
Furthermore, she likely lacks the formal education and management skills to run an operation of that complexity anyway.
So her returns just flatten out. The systemic structure of capital access forces her to remain a micro-entrepreneur forever. She hits the ceiling of the L curve.
Yep. And the research points out that instead of growing one business to a sustainable wealth-generating scale, she might just start 3 different tiny businesses.
Like diversifying, but horizontally.
Right. She'll sell hot food in the morning, sort trash midday, and trade Ceres in the afternoon just to keep her labor fully utilized because she can't scale any single operation.
So it's a structural cap on growth. You're provided the tools to patch the leaky roof, but the system denies you the materials to ever build a second floor.
Exactly. And the way some clients interact with these MFIs reveals an even more complex layer of the scarcity mindset. Get this, some clients borrow money from MFIs at 24% interest and then deposit that exact borrowed money straight into a savings account to yields almost 0 return.
Wait, they are actively paying a bank a 24% premium to hold their own money.
Yes.
Traditional economics would label that deeply, profoundly irrational. I mean, why would you do that?
Right through the lens of a rational actor with infinite bandwidth, it makes 0 sense. But through the lens of scarcity and tunneling, it is actually a highly logical survival strategy.
How so?
Well, if a vendor has cash on hand, the immediate demands of her environment will consume it. A sick relative will ask for help, a persistent salesperson will knock on the door, or there will be some cultural obligation to contribute to a lavish neighborhood wedding.
Oh, I see. The poor are constantly surrounded by temptations, social obligations, and minor emergencies.
Yeah, so by borrowing at 24% and locking it away, they are essentially purchasing a forced discipline mechanism.
Wow.
They are paying a high financial premium to protect their future selves from the tunneling reactive mind of their present selves.
That is fascinating. But if the grassroots solutions like microfinance hit this L-curve ceiling, we have to look at the macro level, right?
Right.
Like, why aren't big top-down government programs or massive international aid agencies just fix the overarching system? We know the mechanics of the poverty trap, so why is it so incredibly difficult to deploy macro aid effectively?
Because those top-down solutions almost always run headfirst into what the authors call the 3 Is: ideology, ignorance, and inertia.
Ideology, ignorance, and inertia.
Yeah. Systemic failures at the national or global level rarely stem from malice or a desire to keep people poor. They are almost always born of these 3 massive blind spots.
Which maps perfectly to a concept from Thinking in Systems, right? The shifting the burden archetype.
Exactly. When a system shifts the burden, it spots a complex problem and opts for a quick, symptomatic fix. A government drops $1 billion in food aid, or writes a sweeping generalized policy.
Right. It relieves the immediate political or social pressure, making the donors feel effective.
Yeah.
But the underlying capability of the local system continues to erode.
Right. The region becomes addicted to the external intervention rather than developing the internal infrastructure to fix the root cause.
So the 3 Ns are the exact mechanisms that drive that shifting the burden trap.
Yes.
Let's deconstruct ideology first. The sources highlight the grand overarching debates in development economics. You have figures like Jeffrey Sachs arguing that poor countries are caught in a geographic and health-based poverty trap.
Right.
And his ideology suggests we need a big push, like dropping a massive coordinated ton of foreign aid to eradicate malaria, build roads, and kickstart a virtuous economic cycle.
And then on the other side of the ideological spectrum, you have economists like William Easterly. His ideology argues that massive foreign aid creates toxic dependency, it fuels corrupt autocratic governments, and it distorts local markets.
Right.
His solution is basically to pull back and let free markets and local entrepreneurs organically solve the problems.
Both are sweeping, elegant ideologies that look great on a whiteboard in Geneva or Washington, D.C.
They look perfect on paper.
Right. But the problem with ideology is that it views the world from 30,000 feet. It assumes a uniform, frictionless system that simply does not exist. It completely ignores the messy, complex, bandwidth-taxed reality of the actual people on the ground.
Which leads directly to the second, ignorance.
Ignorance.
Designing massive programs without knowing how the target population actually lives and makes decisions. Let's examine a really concrete example from the text. The deployment of government nurses in rural India.
Okay.
The ideology behind the program was totally noble and politically popular, right? The state should provide free, dedicated healthcare access to the rural poor.
But the program was designed in complete ignorance of the ground conditions.
Complete
The
ignorance.
policymakers in the air-conditioned capital mapped out territories on paper, assigning nurses workloads that were physically impossible for a single human being to complete.
The geographic distances between the villages were vast, often lacking paved roads or reliable transport, and the nurses were expected to cover these massive territories, maintain impossibly detailed bureaucratic records for the Central Health Ministry, and manage local clinics that routinely lacked basic medical supplies.
They were structurally set up to fail. The system demanded they perform a job that literally couldn't be done.
And this is where the third inertia really takes hold.
Okay.
It quickly became glaringly obvious that the system was broken. Independent researchers found massive chronic absenteeism among the nurses. Clinics were padlocked during the day because the nurses, realizing the job was impossible and unmonitored, simply stopped showing up.
But the bureaucracy kept the program running for years.
Years.
Inertia kept a failed system alive simply because the administrative doxes were being checked, salaries were being paid, and the government could point to a spreadsheet claiming they had deployed thousands of nurses.
The inertia of a large organization often overrides the reality of its failure. And the sources provide another staggering example regarding village education committees in India.
Oh, right. I remember this one.
Again, the ideology was beautiful. Democratize education by empowering local parents to oversee the village schools, monitor teacher attendance, and allocate funds. The national government legally mandated the creation of these committees across the country.
But the ignorance in the design was just breathtaking.
It really was.
The policymakers assumed that rural parents, many of whom were dealing with the severe bandwidth tax of poverty we discussed earlier, had the time, the information, and the social capital to actually challenge a politically connected government teacher.
And when the researchers surveyed the villages, they found that 92% of the parents didn't even know the education committee existed.
92%.
Yeah, and of the parents who were officially listed on the committee, a quarter of them had no idea they were members.
Wow, so someone had just forged their signatures to fulfill the bureaucratic mandate.
Basically, yeah. But because of inertia, the government kept funding and tracking the program, declaring it a massive success in decentralization, when in reality, the systemic structure hadn't changed at all.
So these three is ideology, ignorance, and inertia. They prevent leaders from seeing the real leverage points in a system. They design programs for an idealized world populated by rational actors with infinite time, rather than the real world populated by exhausted, tunneling humans.
Exactly.
And this bandwidth tax doesn't just happen in a Chennai market or a rural Indian clinic, right?
Yeah.
These principles govern literally every human organization.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's pivot this into the boardroom. For the CEO, the startup founder, or just the middle manager analyzing their own team's underperformance, what is the biggest mistake a business leader makes if they ignore this concept of systemic scarcity?
The fundamental mistake is buying into the myth of the rational actor within their own organization. Leaders often assume their employees, their middle managers, or their customers possess infinite cognitive bandwidth and are making decisions based on perfect long-term rationality.
Right, like when a major corporate strategy fails or a critical product launch misses its deadline, the instinct of the CEO is almost always to look at the individuals.
Yeah. They say the team lacks motivation, or we have a toxic culture, or they just aren't working hard enough.
Blaming the person.
Right. And it is the exact trap that the pioneering psychologist Alphonse Chapanis discovered when he was called in to investigate World War II bomber crashes.
Oh, the B-17 bombers. This is a crazy story.
It is. So the military was experiencing a terrifying number of runway crashes with their B-17 bombers. The planes were returning from missions attempting to land and inexplicably crashing into the tarmac. The military leadership, looking at the problem from 30,000 feet, constantly blamed pilot error.
They blamed the individuals training their focus or their motivation.
Exactly. But Chapanis ignored the pilot's motivation and looked directly at the system. He literally climbed inside the cockpit.
And he discovered that the cockpit controls were designed with fatal ignorance of human bandwidth under stress.
Total ignorance. The lever that controlled the landing gear and the lever that controlled the wing flaps were physically identical and placed right next to each other in the dark.
That is insane design. In a high-stress, high-scarcity situation like returning from a combat mission, navigating anti-aircraft fire, dealing with utter exhaustion, A pilot's cognitive bandwidth is completely maxed out.
Right, they are tunneling.
They're tunneling. They reach down to lower the landing gear, grab the identical lever right next to it, retract the flaps, and the plane drops out of the sky.
The military thought they had a pilot motivation problem. Japanis proved they had a systemic design problem that overtaxed human bandwidth.
Wow.
The biggest mistake a leader makes is blaming the pilot when they should be redesigning the cockpit.
That is brilliant. So if a corporate team is constantly putting out fires and missing long-term strategic goals, they're tunneling. They aren't lazy. Their cognitive bandwidth is maxed out by the system they work within.
Yeah.
Like a team with a messy balance sheet of double-booked meetings, constant blare. Slack notifications and shifting priorities is existing in a state of severe scarcity. If your calendar is 100% full, you have zero slack.
And without Slack, an organization can never become what systems theorist Peter Senge calls a learning organization.
A learning organization.
Yeah, Slack is the oxygen of innovation. Without it, there is no room to prototype new ideas, no room to step back and evaluate your underlying mental models, and absolutely no room to fix the root causes of the 3 Is.
The organization is just forever shifting the burden, fighting the immediate fires, and sliding down the corporate S-curve.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for us today? It seems like good strategy requires a diagnosis that links at systemic structures, not just snapshots of individual failure.
A true leader must create fault-tolerant systems, systems that account for the very real limitations of human bandwidth, whether you are structuring a microloan repayment schedule for a vendor in Chennai or designing a sprint timeline for a software engineering team in Silicon Valley.
We have covered immense ground today. I mean, we started with the mathematics of the S-curve, realizing that sometimes a small infusion of capital just guarantees a crash landing if you don't have enough fuel to break the gravity of basic survival.
We explored the bandwidth tax of scarcity, understanding why the tunneling mind makes choices like paying 24% to save money that look irrational from a distance, but are vital survival mechanisms up close.
We saw how the informal markets leverage intimidation and social networks because formal banks fail to design for the administrative friction of poverty. And we deconstructed how the 3-4 are. Is ideology, ignorance, and inertia really blind policymakers and derail well-intentioned top-down systems?
And finally, we brought it into the cockpit, realizing that leaders must design their organizations for actual human behavior, complete with all its cognitive limits.
To tie all these systemic threads together, I'd love to hear your final thoughts on this.
Well, I want to leave the listener with a concept from the brilliant systems thinker Donella Meadows. She dedicated her life to finding the points of highest leverage in any complex system, the places where a small shift produces a massive structural change.
All right.
She argued that the highest leverage point of all is the paradigm.
The paradigm. The unstated mindset, the deeply held beliefs out of which the entire system arises.
Exactly. It's the assumptions we don't even know we're making.
Hmm.
If a society assumes the poor are fundamentally lazy, it will design punitive, friction-heavy welfare systems that further tax their bandwidth.
Right.
If a CEO assumes their employees are inherently unmotivated, they will design rigid micromanagement structures that destroy organizational slack. If our own personal or organizational systems are stuck in a repeating loop of failure, we have to look past the symptoms and ask ourselves, what is the deeply held, unstated assumption we haven't questioned?
Are we constantly trying to fix the pilot when the data is screaming at us to redesign the cockpit? Because until we stop expecting the flawless precision of a mathematical model and start designing systems that embrace the messy bandwidth tax reality of the human mind, we're just going to keep charging a fruit vendor 4.69% daily interest and wondering why she hasn't bought a rocket ship. That's all for today's deep dive. See you next time.